Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the organizers, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this conference to discuss the very interesting hot topic today, student-centeredness and student-centered approach, and also its links to quality of teaching and learning. This conference is a result of last year's work of a so-called ad hoc working group of the Nordic Council of Ministers, which I had a pleasure to chair. And it is also a part of this year's Finnish presidency of the Nordic Council of Ministers. And maybe Mirella, as a secretary of this working group and also this conference, would like to say a few words too.
Yes. Can you put on the microphone? Thank you. So my name is Mirella Nordblad, working as a senior advisor at the Finnish Education Evaluation Center, FINEC, and on behalf of FINEC, I really want to warmly wish you welcome to this conference. And we are so pleased that there's been so much interest in the conference, and we've been able to gather so much knowledge and expertise here today. A couple of words just about the program of today. I won't go into detail, but after lunch, there will be 2 parallel sessions, and the session 1 will be in this room, and the session 1 is on the changing roles of students and teachers. And the second one is in the room next door, veranda 3, and the session is on the quality of degree education in terms of competences and skills of graduates. So you can freely choose which one you're going to participate in. And then we'll come again for the wrap-up of the conference to this room, veranda 4.
So, thank you. And the opening speech will be given by Anita Lehikoinen, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Education and Culture. Please, Anita.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's always exciting to give the opening speech. Everybody is waiting for a very well-structured speech, but in fact I have a few lines, and I thought that the topic is something that we have been discussing many times before, but it is very interesting after all these years. And obviously it is a great pleasure to see so many colleagues from all Nordic countries in this conference, and we think it is really an important part of our presidency program. And the presidency program so far, we have dealt with quite a few issues in the fields of education, higher education, culture and research. And I would like to say that perhaps the most important topic has been the quality, the digital world and the change in operating environment for the whole field of education, and also equality and quality and integration of the education systems. And we have talked a lot about the internationalization of education and, of course, the changing situation in all Nordic countries vis-à-vis the refugee situation that took us all by surprise last year. That has been also a topic of our discussions. And for Finland, it is of very high value that every 5 years we can have the presidency in the Nordic Council of Ministers and have these joint events with our Nordic colleagues and discuss important matters. And it is so interesting to see how much common there are between all our countries, and yet we are very different in many our structural choices, and also, as we were just talking about, the governance structures, for example, in higher education. Very different choices being made, and all for very good reasons. And it only tells that education, even higher education, still is very much interlinked with the cultural environment as we speak. Well, Importance of internationalization and the topic of quality assurance, they go together. Many of us, we've been in the Bologna family from the very beginning, and we know that there can't be mobility without quality assurance. So quality assurance is the cornerstone for mobility so that it can be based on mutual trust, and we can take the differences in our education systems and learning approaches and still make use of the mobility schemes and accept studies and credits done in other country. If I take a look at our presidency program and the program of the Finnish government for higher education and research, we see that there are a lot of shared topics. And I would say that in the essence, it is all about enhancing quality in higher education. And obviously we also have all kinds of goals for higher education, but they all come down to quality and quality management and quality culture in higher education. And when we talk about student-centered approach to teaching and learning, it is something that we have been very much involved with at least 10-20 years or more. We talked about a lot of students and the changing the focus to students with the Bologna process, and the kind of mindset change started, at least in Finland, in those years. And now when we take a look at the system, what else could it be? So students are the focal point in higher education. Higher education institutions are there for students and obviously for research, but the students are the main point in higher education institutions. So we should, and higher education and the institution should serve students. Well, is this an idea that is commonly shared at the institutional level? I'm not sure. Perhaps not, because we still need conferences like this and many working groups working on the issue. Well, in Finland, and as in many other, or I would say in all Nordic countries, we take a broader look at the role of students in higher education. In Finland, we still don't speak about students as clients to higher education. They are an integral part of the higher education community, and this is our definition in the universities and in our Universities of Applied Sciences Act. And this is very important, because students have always been active in Finland, and they are active also in quality assurance, because they have the learner experience comes from the students, and they have a major role to play in developing teaching and learning in universities and Universities of Applied Sciences. And also the changes, the students see them first. They are living the future in many ways. And it takes a long time before we can adjust our national regulations and degree programs. But people, young people and adult students, mature students, when they combine studies and work, as most of our Nordic students do, they see how the world is changing. So the competencies, skills and competencies they need in working life now, and we talk about 21st century skills and competencies, they are the challenges our students face. And the student body is much more diverse than we usually think or see the situation. And in many cases, at least in Finland, we still tend to plan our educational provision and teaching and learning structures so that we think the student body as being those young students who study full-time. Well, this is not true in Finland, it's not true in other Nordic countries, but how should the system, at systems level, we should perhaps react to this? And also the expectations of the learning experience. It is very different for a freshman from direct school leavers and then people who have perhaps many years of work experience and even professional experience, and they come to complete or study for a new degree. So these approaches, they really should start from the needs of the students, and then the student would be in the center automatically. And as I said, the students are not clients, they are part of the higher education community. So it means that students are engaged in the learning process from the very beginning, from the designing of the degree programs and for the assessment and evaluation of those programs. And this is a very important starting point for us. In Finland, as you all probably know, we are very proud of our educational achievements, and we are the PISA wonderland still. We are eagerly waiting for the results of the next PISA results, and they will be out on the Independence Day, so it must be a big celebration of us, so 6th of December. And then we see what is happening to the learning achievements of our 15-year-olds, especially in mathematics. It will be very, very interesting to see. But so far, so good. And we have always been very strong in the cognitive side of the education and the achievement. And now when we listen to the feedback from our world of work, business and industry community, what do they expect from graduates from higher education? And they all say that they would like to have graduates with strong communication skills, teamwork skills, problem solving, creativity even, and critical thinking. And then if we go through the degree programs, it's very difficult to pinpoint where these skills are being taught or learned. And this is very true from the Finnish education system from the very beginning. Even in early childhood education, we do emphasize the cognitive skills and competencies. And then if we take a look at societies at large, at European level or at global level, then we can see that there is definitely a need for different kinds of competencies. Now, how to make democratic societies survive and get better, and how to make people interested in developing societies and international collaboration in a bigger sense. So this is definitely a challenge for us. And also one part of that kind of quality evaluation and assessments that is easily lost in the, it's much more easier to find indicators and evaluate the cognitive skills and competency than these soft or transversal skills, however you want to label them. And then also when we think about higher education and especially universities, there is a very strong pressure in Finland that we should be able to tell more about the impact of higher education and impact of universities. And I think many colleagues can recognize this challenge and pressure from society and from the world of work. And then it is typical, I think, for us working in the educational and fundamental research sectors that we stress the importance of the education as such and basic research. And we say that the biggest impact of universities come through those graduates who are civilized and they have in-depth knowledge in their disciplines or educational fields, and then they can contribute to building up the society and in also the economic structures and have a big cultural impact in society. But there is this pressure also. How do they contribute to the economic well-being of our country, and how do they, universities and students and researchers and research community at large, how do they contribute to help reforming our economic structures? In Finland, you know that we used to be the Nokia wonderland. Now the cluster is in big crisis, and we can see that there's a massive overcapacity of forest pulp and paper in the world, so it has meant that our economic structures are very much changing. And many people from, especially from the economic sector, are saying, how are universities contributing to this change? Do they have really an impact in the well-being of our society and economic life? And this perhaps is something that we also have to take into account when we talk about quality of our degree programs and the learning results in higher education. It's not an easy task. I know it is being discussed at international level, OECD, EU, they all have their work done into it, but it's not very easy to come up with indicators. You can perhaps evaluate it, but to find indicators that would be fair to all fields of education, that seems to be a very difficult task. Well, then we say that it is the educated people, it's the quality, high-quality research that make it possible to have a broad-based knowledge base in society, and above that, or based on this broad-based knowledge, you can build an innovation system. And this innovation system, it is intertwined with the building of knowledge base, we think, at the Ministry of Education and Culture. And we keep on explaining this model to all interested parties. But what is the glue between this kind of intrinsic value of education and research, basic research? And we think that the glue can be the interaction and dialogue between universities and higher education institutions and the society at large. And now many people say that, because this is something that the universities and polytechnics or higher education institutions, they are supposed to do this, interact between societies, different stakeholders by legislation. And now that we should find indicators also for this work. And is it quality? Are they quality indicators that they, people, teachers, researchers, faculty have been involved in all kinds of different missions of universities? Does it contribute to the quality of degree programs? And does it help the students prepare themselves for the challenges in working life? Difficult issues also there. Well, then when we talk about transforming higher education, universities of applied sciences, other higher education institutions, then we turn our eyes to incentives. And I think one of the most discussed topics in the country seems to be the funding model for universities. And that seems to be the solution to all kinds of problems in higher education and research. And sometimes when we have been around for quite a few rounds of developing the funding model, we say that we haven't yet seen a time where the amount of euros for the university budget would have grown when we further develop the funding model. But that seems to be the kind of national hobby. But obviously it is very important to see that you have the incentives right for the quality and effectiveness and impact of the universities. And now that with the new legislation we have for universities and polytechnics, it has made our students also, I would say, not only stakeholders or parts of the higher education community, but they are actually the almost the shareholders in universities and universities of applied sciences, because they have the duty to study and to complete degrees, and by their performance we judge and evaluate universities. So it is up to the students to bring the resources to universities and universities of applied sciences. And I think this has been actually one of the most important things we have ever done for the quality of teaching and learning in our universities. And I think it was quite remarkable that when the funding model was changed or amended to reward very clearly for the degrees completed and for the share of students completing 55 credits per academic year, when a chair of one of the university boards said that, well, this means that we have to pay attention to teaching and learning as students. And we thought it was quite a good notice to make after quite a few hundred years of existence of our universities. So there's for students' perspectives, there's a right to study, and there's a right to expect that kind of teaching and support, guidance and counseling even from universities, that students can complete their degree studies in target time. This is in our legislation. But it also means in the same legislation that the students are supposed to complete their studies in given time. So it is not a kind of service provided for individual student for as long as the individual students wants. It's a kind of collective responsibility to make the system work. And this is a very big thing, I think. Well, then in Finland, as in many other countries, we talk about structural development of higher education. And how does this then relate to the quality of teaching and learning? And we think that the streamlining of our national higher education systems and network is a necessity. We know that the resources we have for higher education institutions, they are not growing as much as they should be, and the public purse will be very tight for many years ahead, it seems so. And we at the Ministry, we think that it is not a right for students to have just any higher education nearby, but a high quality higher education, a good learning experience. And that's why we can justify the ideas of structural streamlining of the network also from the point of view of our students. So the quality has to be the same, and we at national level we must take the responsibility to have that kind of provision of higher education that we can make sure that the quality can be at the same level in all places. And still so much more to say about the changing role of the teachers and students, but perhaps I leave that to experts. And just finish off by wishing you all very warmly welcome to Helsinki. We are very pleased with the weather. As many of you know, it could be so much worse. And also I'm sure that you will have a wonderful conference, because the topics and the areas of discussion seem so very interesting, and they are issues that we have to come up with new answers, I would say every year. They are constantly being challenged, and we have to meet up with the challenge. Thank you.
And now it's a pleasure to have greetings from the Nordic Council of Ministers, Head of Department Anders Geertsen. Please.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you to Finland for organizing this conference. Thank you to the Ministry of Education and Culture and to the Permanent Secretary. I'm Anders Geertsen from the Secretariat of the Nordic Council of Ministers. You know, the chairmanship of the Nordic collaboration rotates every year, and this year it is Finland. And very often the topics and the things we work on together are carried on from one year to the next. And this issue about education was started a long time ago, and it will continue, and next year it will be Norway from 2017, also carrying these issues forward. The Nordic collaboration takes many forms, and we are very individual countries, but it makes so much sense to look at our experiences, what we do, what we encounter, how we solve problems, and to exchange ideas. And more the Nordic region is looking at itself to see how it can collaborate on a regional level in a very global context. You know, we have always to reinterpret what should be done on a national level, what should be done on an international level, and what could be done in this space between where you have the region. Our ministers and governments want to see our Nordic region as a very visible and outgoing region. They want our region to be able to attract talent. And here, education and higher education is very, very important. Back in 2014, the Ministers of Education and Research asked us to set up this expert group. This expert group to look at teaching and to look at quality in higher education. And you know, if you want to compete, it's a very good thing to look at quality. It's a good place to start. I should perhaps also mention that in 2014, when this group was created, two sort of related groups or working groups were also established. One to look at the role of teachers and the profession of teaching. And a third one to look specifically at the teaching and training of professionals in welfare and healthcare. So 3 groups were established. The role of this group obviously is to look at and discuss what is quality in higher education, how can it be measured, how can we even talk about it, do we have indicators, how is it related to teaching outcomes, what is happening. What is happening now, I think the Permanent Secretary mentioned it very clearly, in a student-centered approach where hopefully there's more and more focus on learning and teaching. It is not my role to go deeply into this because you will do that over the course of this day. I will just remind you that some of the recommendations from this group do touch on programs and initiatives run by the Nordic Council of Ministers. First of all, there is the Nordplus program. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this program. It's a vast program with 5 sub-programs, and Nordplus is all about stimulating and supporting collaboration, mobility in education, ranging from primary education, secondary education, vocational training, and indeed higher education. So Nordplus supports a large number of projects, collaborations, exchanges, both on an individual level, teacher level, scholar level, student level, but also on the class level and between schools. And indeed, the key thing is that Nordplus higher education can play a key role when institutions in our region are working together on quality issues. The second program I will mention is in fact our biggest in terms of funding, namely Nordforsk. our Nordic collaboration in research. Nordforsk, based in Oslo, but Nordforsk is a platform where our research councils and research funding mechanisms, where they meet and decide where will they want to build joint research programs. And I'll just draw your attention specifically to one of these programs, namely a very important one called Education for Tomorrow. Education for Tomorrow, obviously also very much concerned with teaching and very much concerned with quality in higher education. These two programs are substantial. From the Nordic Council of Ministers, we fund the Nordplus program with approximately 10 million euros per year, and the Nordforsk program with approximately 15 million euros. On top of that, you have the vast funding from the research councils. So together, these research programs build into much more volume. I will also take this opportunity to mention two other areas of cooperation on a Nordic level, which in a way touch on the topic of this conference, namely the Nordic Master Program, which we are happy to say is now becoming a permanent program. The Nordic Master Program, where 3 or more universities group together and create a joint Nordic Master Program. Now, what does this do? It does a number of good things, but at least it puts the Nordic region on the map of international education. That's a very good thing. Another very good thing is that if you want to attract students, you have to be good in quality and you have to be able to prove it. And when we look at the student base for our Nordic Master Programs, they are attracting a high number of students from other Nordic countries and a very high number of students from outside this region. Last but not least, I will mention that we facilitate collaboration when it comes to recognition of diplomas and qualifications. This might be sort of not entirely into the core of your conference, but still it's important, because recognition of diploma and qualifications, what is this about? This is about what the Permanent Secretary mentioned, namely trust and mobility. And these days we can see that this is becoming even more important in a time where we have refugees and we have migrations. So one of the new areas where this collaboration will focus is how can we learn from each other when it comes to understanding, recognition, assessment of qualifications from those coming to our countries from other parts of the world, either with diplomas or perhaps without diplomas, but still with skills and competences. We are very happy to support all this work. And you know, when I say support, don't think that we pay all the members of these working groups. We do not. They just work. And we are very happy about that. All we do is that we finance modestly some of the running costs incurred when you work together. So the Nordic collaboration is very much about very dedicated people wanting to work together and working together without being paid from the Nordic Council. We can now and then arrange coffee breaks in their meetings and perhaps even a place where they can meet, but that is about it. So thank you everybody for putting so much effort into working together on a Nordic level. And I wish you all a very good conference and thank you for your attention.
So now it's time to give you an overview on the work of this so-called ad hoc group. Somebody asked me, what is that name for? What does it mean? But it means that it was not a permanent group. It was an ad hoc group for a special task and for a limited time. So it was appointed last year, at the beginning of last year, or maybe even a bit earlier. And the task was to discuss quality in higher education and the new, maybe common challenges related to quality in higher education in the Nordic countries. And as the representative from the Nordic Council of Ministers said, it is also an issue of competition. We have to find ways how to demonstrate the strengths of the Nordic higher education institutions and Nordic higher education, and how to encourage mobility. And the task was also to propose new forms for Nordic cooperation. And of course, one basic background document was that we have now the new European standards and guidelines, especially the first part, which is about the internal quality assurance of higher education institutions, that emphasizes much more than before teaching and learning, and which has also student-centered learning, student-centered approach as a standard. There were representatives from all Nordic countries and self-governing regions except Åland. We were 15 members in the group. And there are several present today, so I would like to ask you to stand up who are present from the working group. Many of you will be presenting later today also. What were the methods or the working of that group? Every country prepared 2 country reports. First one about the challenges today and the issues that are discussed in every country. And then we prepared another country report on the special topic we had chosen, the student-centered approach. We organized, of course, meetings, as working groups usually do. And then we had a very successful working method. We organized workshops for local experts, because of course there was a lot of expertise in the working group, but not all expertise from the field of higher education. So we invited people from higher education institutions, students, student organizations, and also from working life external stakeholders to discuss these topics. And this appeared to be a very good working method. So we organized 4 workshops, one in Helsinki, one in Copenhagen, one in Oslo, and one in Stockholm. And prepared for the Council of Ministers 2 reports. The first one on the landscape and common challenges, and then the other one on the student-centered approach. Actually, I'm not quite sure if the final report is available on the website of the Nordic Council of Ministers, but anyway, it exists. And we can send it. And there are also short reports from every workshop. What were the main topics at every workshop? And many of the workshop presentations or presenters will be present today here too. We have found excellent presentations for today's conference also. So as the permanent secretary said, we are similar, but anyway, we are different. And in every country, higher education has undergone and is undergoing reforms, and several reforms, both in governance, in systems, in policies, and of course also in degrees and curricula. At first glance, similar, but actually quite different. But the international landscape is the same for all Nordic countries, of course. We are all Bologna countries. We are all facing the same challenges as other European countries, and globally too. There is an increasing diversity in student population, as was also mentioned in the opening speech. There are new forms of delivery of education, enabled by technology. Digitalization of higher education is a hot topic today. And that means that also there is a demand for new competencies for teachers and a great demand for pedagogical training for university teachers. And on the other hand, there are new requirements from the working life, especially for generic competencies. We have moved from the quite traditionally quite strongly knowledge-based thinking to competence-based thinking, learner outcomes-based thinking, and also from quite strongly discipline-based higher education towards, at least in many countries, towards wider, more generic bachelor degrees and more problem-based thematic master's degrees. And there has been a strong emphasis on student-centeredness in the whole Bologna process. We need more flexible learning paths. There are different individual needs of students and so on. We will get soon a more detailed and more specialized view on what is student-centered approach from Björn, but here are some introductory remarks. We can see the shift from knowledge or teacher-centered approach towards a more learner-focused in the Bologna communiques, especially from Berlin communique onwards, and we can see it in the revised European standards and guidelines where we have student-centered learning as a standard for the first time for internal quality assurance. That means that it will be seen also in the national quality assurance, external quality assurance systems sooner or later. It's a very difficult term. It's an umbrella term for very different ways of organizing, understanding and organizing teaching, learning activities and assessment. But maybe some points anyway. Of course, in student-centered approach, we see students as active participants in their own learning and students having different learner styles, different learning styles. And as Anita mentioned, also as shareholders of the university today, at least in Finland, with our funding models. So the role of the teachers is changing also. Teachers' role is more to be a facilitator, to improve students' learning, and of course also the teacher's own teaching. I hope that student-centeredness encourages both teachers and students to try to find more innovative, new innovative methods and ideas. And of course we do have now already new types of learning environments, both physical and virtual. And of course, it integrates students into the academic community and hopefully increases motivation and engagement. And of course, student engagement, especially for first-year students, is a very important topic for every institution. When we studied the student-centered approach in the different Nordic countries and regions, we saw that there are quite many ideas quite much understanding we share, but there were also differences. And there is no one model. There is no purely student-centered approach in the Nordic countries or or anywhere. And it could be better defined as some kind of a continuum from a very clearly student-centered to a more knowledge teacher-centered approach. As Anita also mentioned, we have a very strong tradition of active student participation, not only in institutional decision-making and management, but also in the development of higher education. Students are members of all kinds of working groups developing education and, for instance, curriculum development. Students are responsible for their own learning process, for the learning, but of course maybe they should take even more responsibility for the learning process. And what is also important and maybe less discussed, students are resources for each other's learning, not only responsible for their own learning. This will surely change the role of teachers and learners, and this will be the topic of one of the sessions today. And that means that there is also a need for educational leadership, which is also a topic which is discussed quite a lot today, because it is crucial for finding the new ways and developing the pedagogical, university pedagogy to have strong educational leadership at higher education institutions. And as mentioned, student-centered approach is now a standard for quality assurance, and it will be very interesting to see how it will be addressed in the external national quality assurance systems in the future. Our task was also to propose forms of Nordic cooperation, and Nordplus and Nordforsk are of course the very important organizations or platforms for this. We discussed several issues which could be interesting for common Nordic research and sharing of experience and expertise and good practices that exist surely in the different Nordic higher education institutions. One was the changing roles of teachers and students, because this means really a change in the teaching and learning culture. Of course, pedagogical development. We will have today, later in the afternoon, also examples from university pedagogical development from different institutions. Educational leadership is one important topic, as I mentioned already, developing of learning environments, and of course the digitalization of learning, teaching and learning. And of course developing methods and also indicators, as mentioned, for external evaluations of the quality of teaching and learning. There were also other topics we discussed. So very much different opportunities for sharing expertise and also for research on higher education. We also proposed some forums, some fora for cooperation. We could have joint development projects, different development projects, and also research projects on the quality of teaching and learning. Maybe find some resources from Nordforsk. And we would like to continue this as a series of annual Nordic conferences, and maybe we will hear about the next conference later today. So this kind of annual Nordic conferences on the quality of higher education and teaching and learning. And the ad hoc group will also continue as an informal professional network. As you saw, we have several members here present, and we would like to act as an informal, although we were an ad hoc group, but anyway, we would like to continue in a way or another, because it was a very, very fruitful way of cooperating with all Nordic countries and regions. So this was only a short introduction to the topic, and now it's my great pleasure to give the floor to
Are there any questions?
Yes, if there are any questions about the working group and I can promise that we send the report if it isn't available on the website of the Nordic Council of Ministers. No. So, Björn Stesaker from the Department of Education, University of Oslo, is a very well-known specialist and expert in higher education, I think in all fields of higher education, from organizational issues and leadership until quality assurance. And he will now give us a keynote presentation on student-centered approach in teaching and learning outcomes, not only an idealized picture, but also the complexities in this topic, and of course also on the connection of student-centeredness with quality assurance. So please, Björn.
Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me, everyone? Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to come to the land of the Mummi. The land of the Mummi is, of course, the land of slow but deep learning. What I will try to do now is, unfortunately, to be a bit faster. I have a lot of land to cover today. So I'm supposed to say something about student-centered teaching. I'm supposed to say something about quality assurance, and I'm supposed to say something about learning outcomes and how all of these issues and activities connect in higher education. And as you can see from the subtitle, Connections and Complexities, that's a polite way of saying that I will also be a bit critical, but also hopefully a bit constructive, because I do think that there is a lot of potential in student-centered teaching. I'm very much, although some suspect that I'm always against quality assurance, I'm very much in favor of quality assurance. I think quality assurance is really, really needed in higher education, but it has to be designed in the right way. And especially when it comes to the issue of learning outcomes and student-centered teaching, it is very important that we get quality assurance right. And that's what the topic of my presentation today is all about. Okay, so why do we see this growing interest in learning outcomes in student-centered teaching? I think this is all about, and we could hear it also from the permanent secretary today, that the authorities today, they have a special interest in higher education. They have a growing interest in higher education. Higher education is, and the whole educational system is much more important than it has been before. And part of the reason is, of course, if we look into the public expenditure. In most countries you could see, and especially in the Nordic countries, we can see that the health and welfare sectors, they are number one when it comes to public spending. But what's number two? It's not defense, it's not transport, it's education. And of course, as we can see that the number of students are growing in the educational system and in higher education, there are also growing interest in what do we get from the money we spend. Part of this is also that policies today, they are expected to be so-called evidence-based. What that means is sometimes a mystery. But evidence-based is a very popular term. Either if you go to the European Commission or whether you go to the OECD, things has to be evidence-based. What works? Can we see some hard evidence on the impact and what the implementation is all about? And we can see that these national and international quality assurance agencies, they play a very important role as mediators to all of this. And partly, I think we have a lot of representatives from the quality assurance agencies here today, and I think it's very good that we have these kind of meeting places where representatives for quality assurance also can interact with representatives from institutions. I think it's only through dialogue that we can really develop some well-functioning systems here. But basically, you could argue that quality assurance until now has not been about teaching and learning. You could, if you take a historical perspective on quality assurance, you could see that, well, quality assurance basically they've covered everything but teaching and learning in a sense, because they have focused so much on structures and procedures for good reasons. For good reasons. We could hear that the permanent secretary said that external chairman of Finnish university still doesn't really care about, apparently, about the teaching and learning issues. I think that is fast changing, but it underlines the need for perhaps having systems, structures, responsibilities in place in higher education institutions. But the matter of fact is that if we look and take a European perspective even, in most countries we can see that quality assurance has been, checking the boxes whether you have systems, routine, practices in place. But the teaching and learning has been an issue that has been under the responsibility of the institution, as it should be. It's part of the academic autonomy of teachers. If we take a look at teaching and learning, and especially teaching and learning research, they don't care about structures. They are more interested in the individual learning parts of students. You know, what is it that makes students learn? What are the factors that drive the learning of students? And they have shown us through decades of research that there are some interesting aspects here that we can actually adopt to facilitate student learning, to provide the students with a context, to provide them with rapid feedback. There's a lot of well-known elements now that we know have a positive impact on student learning. But these are basically, so far, two worlds apart. And perhaps that is the reason why we have seen in a number of countries, I'm not so sure about, I haven't been to Finland for a couple of years, I'm not quite sure whether this also go for the Finnish. The Finns, you have always been kind of special when it comes to quality assurance. So you have done things your own way, but at least for the rest of Europe, this picture applies. So basically, quality assurance have been criticized, rather standardized, but though, that the teachers, those working in universities and colleges, they haven't really perceived external quality assurance as very relevant. Sometimes they have even perceived it as some kind of an external threat to their work, that they are forced to spend time in meetings while they could spend time with students. But interestingly, also, we could also see that political authorities, even ministries, the European Commission, other international stakeholders are also pointing to quality assurance and saying, well, you have been working now for a number of years, and what is your evidence of your impact? How do we know that quality assurance works? You're here to check the institutions, but how do we know that the work that you're doing is actually, improving teaching and learning, the outcomes of higher education? And of course, and that is of course a very challenging issue to answer. And of course, quality assurance agencies, they have troubles also in replying to those kind of claims. And then we also have rectors, we have institutional leaders at various levels in the university trying to protect their autonomy, pointing to quality assurance and saying, well, you're not really helping us. You say that you are supposed to help us improve, but based on your standards, based on your rules and regulations, you actually hinder our creativity. My standard joke almost is that it's some kind of a paradox that in an era where we have so much focus on innovation and creativity in higher education, most countries have adopted an accreditation system. And accreditation systems, as you know, basically it's about killing innovation, right? It's an exaggeration, of course, but basically accreditation is based on historical standards, and historical standards, well, if Einstein came up with a very creative study program today, I'm not quite sure that it would have been accredited by some agencies around Europe. So this is the standard type of criticisms to quality assurance. And I think those working in quality assurance agencies, they are well aware of this, and they are trying to deal with these challenges as well. And one of the upcoming solutions right now is learning outcomes. Is this an issue in Finland? Is that a yes? Yes. Okay, thank you. And learning outcomes, this is not something that you only have in Finland. We have it in Norway, we have it in a lot of European countries. Learning outcomes, the universal solution. Now we have really found what it takes to bring us to the next level. And especially if we look into the Bologna process, we could see that learning outcomes is really seen as, you know, the thing we need to move forward. And the way to move forward is by using learning outcomes. The point is that, as you know, the Bologna system was basically also about structures, right? It was about introducing the ECTS, the European Credit Transfer System. It was about creating a unified educational structure in the form of bachelor and master degrees. It was about creating some form of standardized ways to conduct quality assurance driven by the European standards and guidelines. So it was about creating structures. But in many countries, and as the evaluations of the Bologna process have shown, you know, those kind of structures haven't really increased transparency always. We still have a lot of transparency, and of course the Bologna process is not about killing the diversity of the European higher education landscape, but it's about also increasing the comparability of education. So how do we do that? And learning outcomes is now seen as a way to get a bit more control over, okay, is engineering education in Finland, is that the same as engineering education in Spain? Is a master in political science in Oslo, is that the same as a master of political science in London, for example? So learning outcomes is seen as a tool that will take us to the next level when it comes to creating transparency in Europe. And of course, as Europe is also facing challenges when it comes to the economic situation, learning outcomes is also taking into account this need for relevance in the sector. The need to create students that can walk straight into working life and be creative, have creative critical thinking, be problem solvers, and what have you. And learning outcomes, fantastically enough, is also seen as a tool for higher education institutions. A tool for developing their planning capacity, you know. Because some universities and colleges also struggle with you know, developing their capacity to improve higher education, because they haven't really had the tools to do so. With quality assurance, especially if you have very specified learning outcomes, suddenly the institutional leadership, you know, develops some kind of capacity to control what's going on at the shop floor. And even though we tend to think that universities are much more centrally controlled today than before, I think there is still, I'm looking at Rita here, I'm not quite sure that Rita always have full control of what's going on in her institution. Maybe Rita would like to comment. Yeah. And finally, I think what we can see here also is that learning outcomes is, and this is something that we will experience, I think, in the years to come. Some have already started out with this, but I think what we can see now is that learning outcome is becoming the new types of criteria for which we are all to be evaluated. So here we are, learning outcomes, the universal solution to some of the problems that we are seeing in higher education today. But let us criticize learning outcomes as well. And it's quite easy. It's not difficult at all. And these are some of the standard critique of learning outcomes. I think you know it all. I think some of you have maybe also joined the choir here. What research on teaching and learning actually have informed us about is that learning processes actually take place in very complex ways. And given that the diversity of the whole student population is increasing as well, well, then you also have the challenge that the learning trajectories is also more diverse than ever. And one implication of that is perhaps that learning outcomes, although that is part of the ambition of learning outcomes, is to prescribe some sort of, this is what you should know after you have completed your education. Well, can we really do that? Can we really specify in detail what students end up with after their education? Isn't there a danger there that by doing that we can maybe narrow down their potential skills and competencies instead of opening up their learning trajectories to new dimensions, to international impulses, to new types of skills and competencies? And some teachers have also been raising their hands and saying, hey, you know, I used to have a lot of control, I used to have a lot of freedom in my classroom. But if now learning outcomes is specified so much in detail that they also, you know, instruct me what to do, where's my professional responsibility here? Is that taken away from me as a consequence? What is my role in the future of higher education if everything is prescribed in the forms of learning outcomes? And finally, the same criticism that can be directed to quality assurance when it comes to innovation and lack of innovation can of course also be directed to learning outcomes. You know, if the future is, you know, if we don't really know what's ahead of us, how is it possible that we can prescribe future competencies? Is that really possible? Should we do that? Okay. So the interesting issue is, of course, then, how do we link learning outcomes and quality assurance? And I think there is a lot of quality assurance agencies throughout Europe that are really struggling with this at the moment. They're really they are working and experimenting and thinking about how can we do this in a sensible way. And I hope that the opportunity today is also to maybe advance this discussion further. A recent survey that was conducted by ENQA, the umbrella organization of European quality assurance agencies, some years ago showed that 2/3 of all quality assurance agencies in Europe are trying to measure some kind of learning outcomes. They are really trying to find ways to do this by finding out indicators and ways to do it. But when they were asked about, you know, how effective was these measures, these indicators, they acknowledged that, well, this is a problem. We are measuring something, but we are not quite happy with what we are measuring. And as this report concluded back in 2012, but I still think it's a valid statement for many quality assurance agencies, also in the Nordic countries, that finding these best practices is really the next frontier for quality assurance. And again, today this is perhaps an opportunity that we should engage with those working in quality assurance to try to discuss and try to find ways to do this in a sensible way. This is my way to try to create the room to maneuver for quality assurance agencies. It's a very I'm a social scientist, so I think in boxes. You know, that's my this is how I think. So this is an insight into my brain. Basically, you have two dimensions here, right? You could measure learning outcomes either at the individual level or trying to do it at the collective level. Or you could say that, well, learning outcomes we can have them as a predefined, standardized definition of that, or we could have a more open-ended way of understanding learning outcomes. And if we look into the upper right corner, that's where a lot of quality assurance agencies have been in the past. That's where the focus of attention has really been in the past. By, focusing on some organizational level indicators, typically dropout, completion rate, employment rates, relevance, but also a lot of input variables. How many professors do you have? Do you have a library? Is there books in the library? Things like that. So a lot of input variables and a lot of output variables. What the learning assessment, the learning outcomes approach is to move the attention to the upper left corner, to focus much more on the individual student, and perhaps moving the focus a bit away from universities. There are some interesting implications of that, I think, especially since we have seen and we've heard today from Anita Lehikoinen that in Finland there is also this evaluation going on about the impact of higher education, I think. So what's the added value of higher education? So what we are doing now is to measure student accomplishment. There is a risk that we can end up with measuring student accomplishment and not the added value of the higher education institutions. We had a very interesting, I don't know whether we could call it an experiment, but are there any Swedes present in the room? Oh yeah. But we had a very interesting experiment in Sweden some years ago where they didn't bother about the organizational, the added value of the organization. They just focused on the student, and they focused on what the student had accomplished during their, as demonstrated by their thesis. I think the Swedes are changing again, but it's an interesting example of perhaps a bit of a extreme focus on a predefined understanding of learning outcomes at the individual level. The interesting, of course, is that if we move down to the lower level of the table, I think we can see that there is a lot of elements there that also fit well with what research tells us about teaching and learning, and what is it that facilitates student learning. But then we need to find criteria and ways to measure perhaps processes instead of either input or output categories. And that is difficult. That is really difficult. And I'm afraid I can't really provide you with the super solution to this. And again, I think this is where we need to come together. But I think this is where the potential also is. That I'm not saying that we should drop the upper level of the table here, but I think what we need now in quality assurance and learning outcome is to have a more comprehensive way to understand measurement of learning outcomes. And that we also, in fact, try to address issues like quality cultures, student-teacher interaction. How can we do that in a sensible way? We know that student-teacher interaction is extremely important for student learning, but how to measure it? How to find indicators? Is it how many times a week they meet? Is it the quality of the discussion they have? How to do that? That is not really easy. So I think this is where the student-centered approach may have some potential in the discussion. If we go back to these standards and guidelines for quality assurance that Rita mentioned, this is actually the standard as it's prescribed in the ESG 215. Institutions should ensure that the programs are delivered in a way that encourages students to take an active role, my underlining, in creating the learning process, and that the assessment of students reflect this approach. This is the responsibility of the institutions. But of course it has implications for quality assurance, because they should potentially then try to find out, are institutions taking their responsibility in this area? And how can that be done? So I would say that if we take this serious, if we really take it serious, that we should try to actively measure, evaluate, assess, the student, the active student. Well, that could really lead us into this open-ended way of understanding learning outcomes. It can provide us with a different perspective in that respect. And I think there is a potential here for quality assurance, because then quality assurance suddenly is no longer only about structures and procedures and rules and responsibilities, but also about, what are the processes that take place in teaching and learning. So I'm fairly positive toward the whole student-centered approach in a way. Of course, as Rita also mentioned, it's a nice metaphor, but it's a metaphor perhaps more than a concept where we have a unified understanding of what it is. As I said before, student learning is quite messy, and there are a lot of possible ways to interpret what student-centered teaching is all about. And when I do some presentation in Europe, especially in front of students are always trying to say that the traditional lecture, what we are doing now, is no longer relevant. We should stop lecturing. Lecturing is not an efficient form of student learning, because now you are all passive. That's the argument. That, of course, is not a valid argument, but it's an argument that it's still, there are a lot of people backing this at the moment, and I think what we do now is to run the risk of having one of the classical forms of exchange between teachers and students to go down the drain as a consequence. Maybe we are doing too much lecturing. That's a different issue. But we also know that lecturing is very, very efficient when it comes to define central concepts, central perspectives in a given field. The best way to do that is through a lecture. So I'm a bit afraid that suddenly now some of the traditional heritage of higher education is suddenly seen as no longer relevant. I'm a little bit afraid of that. I'm a defender of lecturing, but it has to be a lecture with a purpose, not lecturing without purpose. You could evaluate me afterwards. And of course, some of these concepts that have been associated with student-centered approaches, you all know them. I've listed a few here. There are more to be listed if you want. Case-based learning, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, and so on. And there's been a lot of research going on also to find out, what are the unique impact of these methods. And one of the things that research has told us about this is that, and that is perhaps interesting in the Finnish perspective, since you are very good in the cognitive area, is that all of these methods, they are not improving the knowledge of students. You know, they are not more effective methods of improving the knowledge of students, but they learn student different things. They foster collaboration. They foster communication between students. The students are encouraged to use different sides of their of themselves during the learning process. That is what we know, and that is of value in itself, I think. So again, what we really need to do here is to go back to our institutions and really try to rethink, not focusing perhaps on the concepts as such, but trying to focus what do we really want to do with our study programs. I'll end by two scenarios. One horrible scenario and one positive scenario. This is the worst case scenario. And we are in the Nordic countries, we are sensible people, so maybe it doesn't really relate to us, but there is a potential danger also even in the Nordic region here. What higher education is really good at when new expectations is directed our way, what we are really, really good at is to adopt. Some say that universities and colleges are slow learners and we are slow to pick up new things. All empirical research suggests the opposite. The problem is that we are not really, we pick it up, but we don't really implement it. But what we do is we add another layer of duties in our institutions, making our life inside universities and colleges more complicated than ever before. You know, that's part of the reason why we see now more bureaucracy, more problem for teachers to find time to do their basic duties and so forth. And quality assurance agencies, they are suffering a little bit from the same disease. Quality assurance agencies, they used to be rather simple structures where they only had one procedure. Perhaps they conducted program accreditation. That was what they were doing in a particular country. Now we see that they have this arsenal of evaluations and assessments and methods that they have adopted over time. So now in most countries there are evaluations, there are accreditations, there are audits, there are meta-audits and what have you. There are all sorts of activities that quality assurance agencies have picked up and put on top of each other. And my fear is that learning outcomes and some of the ideas related to student-centered teaching becomes yet another layer. Let's find some simplified indicators for that, and then we can tick the box. We are ready to go. And by doing that, I think we are only keeping, if you remember my table, we are only keeping in the upper left and right corner, in the pre-described way of understanding student-centered teaching. So I really hope that we will move here. That we will move to a situation where learning outcomes and student-centered teaching are seen as two extremely interesting concepts to enter into a positive dialogue between quality assurance and institutions, and not least teachers. And as you could see at the bottom of this slide, there is a mysterious thing called HIQA. That stands for the Higher Education Agency that was in the UK in the 90s. They had a very, very simple procedure. They didn't operate with pre-described standards. They operated with a set of questions where it wasn't up to them to decide, because they had to, the proof of evidence was basically on the quality assurance side if you pre-describe all criteria. But here they turn the coin. They leave it to the higher education institutions to offer the evidence. And they have very simple questions. What are you trying to do? I think that relates very much to the learning outcomes idea. What are you trying to do? Why are you doing it? Very simple question. Sometimes extremely difficult to answer. How do you do it? Why are you doing it in this way? And perhaps most interesting of all, how do you know it works? Huh? So, I'm not saying that this is the solution, but it's perhaps an example of the thinking that we now need to develop these and to make productive use of these concepts of learning outcomes and student-centered teaching in higher education. So that's my input for today. Let's hope that we have a productive day. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, and I'm sure that after this presentation everybody agrees that lecturing is a relevant way of teaching and a way that activates our thinking. So now we have plenty of time for comments and questions, so please, who wants to start? Please.
We need to use the microphones because otherwise the people online won't hear the questions.
I'm Lena Levander from Aalto University. Thank you for your very provocative, actually, and I'm sure this lecture was really making everybody think. My comment is concerned about the learning outcomes and how do you prescribe them, because in a way I interpreted from what you were saying that it is a standard, but for me it is more like a breakdown of something that the student is supposed to learn, and a sort of a guidance to the student that this is what we expect you to understand about this subject. Can you say a bit more about this?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a question that addresses this issue about how do we end up with the learning outcomes that we end up with in our institutions, right? What sort of processes have we in place to develop these learning outcomes that are supposed to guide the actions in the study programs? And I think there is a lot of diversity here. And I totally agree with you that it's not always the case that learning outcomes have to be defined in prescribed ways. But at the same time, and especially in universities, we can see that a lot of teachers, if they are involved in this, many teachers, they have a tradition for thinking about the knowledge part, the theoretical part of the education. Of course, it can again be differences when you look into professional programs and what have you. But in many classical university departments, we can see that many teachers are very focused on the knowledge dimension. Perhaps not so focused on the skills dimension and on the general competencies. So that can lead to one kind of skewness when it comes to defining and developing learning outcomes. We can also see examples in other higher education institutions where basically teachers haven't really been interested in going into this kind of activity because they see it only as a bureaucratic activity. Why should we do that? We have done this before. Why should we engage in writing up our learning outcomes in this formal document? It's boring, it's uninterested, I don't want to do it. The interesting stuff there, what happens is because you have to do it, so then it's the administration that sit and write up the learning outcomes based on existing documents and what have you. And teachers are happy because they got off the hook in some sense, and but at some point then it's coming back to them when students then come to and complain that why are you teaching in this way, because in the formal document it's stated that you should do something very different. So but there is a lot of possibility here, and I think what we have seen also in some institutions is that teachers have really used this as an opportunity to come together, to share thoughts and ideas about what the study program is all about, and that has really created some good academic discussions. That it's very rare these days, because people are busy and we are flying all around, and people have one of the unintended consequences of the Bologna reform is that larger academic areas have been broken down into smaller modules, with individual teachers being responsible for individual modules as well. So they are responsible for the modules, but perhaps they don't have the same responsibility for the program as such. So I think the coming together of teachers in productive dialogues, that can actually create some very good things. So, but there are a lot of possible outcomes here. So it really depends how you organize and how you can mobilize, I think, both the administrative but also the academic staff in this kind of work. I think that is extremely important.
There is a microphone coming.
Yes, I'm Clemens Sichel. I'm a teacher at the same university, and I would like to comment on that. Actually, I have been designing courses, planning courses, and there is a part of the learning goals coming from administration, from above. I presume because they have to also fulfill the expectations of the Ministry of Education, so that university produces students who know some other skills than these scientific or technical skills. And I see that not as a problem at the moment. I have still the freedom to choose the other half of the learning goals, but there is a given set of learning goals that we as teachers have to somehow implement in some of our courses anyway. So I think that I feel that that's reality already.
No, but there is a lot of diversity here, and I think this is something that those of you coming from institutions should really bear in mind. That this is also an opportunity. I mean, if you don't do anything, well, then you can make sure that there are someone in your university that will write down these learning outcomes, perhaps in ways that you are not really happy with when it comes to in the end. But in some, and we had some very interesting empirical research in Norway, where we did a survey to the academic staff in a number of universities and colleges, and we asked them, what is your perception of the usefulness of the internal quality assurance system, for example, in your department, of learning outcome descriptions, of student evaluations. We asked them a long list of items, and of course, as you would expect, the academics they were not really that positive when it comes to the internal quality assurance system in their department, but they were really positive about the learning outcomes. They thought that the learning outcomes somehow was related to their discipline and field, and that this is a concept that was more relevant for them than traditional quality assurance in a way. So I think there is a possibility here for learning outcomes to be perceived as something very useful by academic staff, perhaps more than some more procedural ways of conducting quality assurance.
Ramos Spande from the National Student Union of Universities of Applied Sciences. we talked a lot about learning outcomes and we talked about student-centered approach, but then my question is mostly like, where are we directing these learning outcomes to? Are we directing them to economical benefits and employment of the people? Are we directing them to societal benefits? Are we directing them to individual benefits? And then when we are talking about, you talked about skills and competences, I just got a confirmation that I will be part of the launch of the skills agenda that's being launched by the European Parliament, and that's another thing that will shift a bit more student learning into the skills and competences, which might be more focused on employability, where will be the individual awareness of the person when he goes to university or higher education and he develops. And then we talk about student-centered approach. What should be the percentage of the students involved in the student-centered approach development itself? We talk about student-centered approach, but often we don't have the students there involved. We talk about designing curricula and designing degree programs, but then there's academic staff, and then you complain that there's no teachers, but my complaint would be that there's no students. And then maybe another complaint would be that there's no also economic economic stakeholders or societal stakeholders involved in if we are focusing our outcomes on societal or economic development. So where would we stand on that if we do only this sort of approach?
And what is your answer to that question?
My answer to that question is that we would need to have more students involved in when we are developing student-centered approach. And actually, we had last week in Poland in Worklov when we talked with student representatives over student-centered approach and lifelong learning as well. How do we include that in student-centered approach, because they are both really connected as well. So I would like to see also, this is also maybe a mark for everybody here, since we are stakeholders of education and some of you are deans and also program developers on your institutions, that the student should always remain kind of on the view of it, especially if it affects his outcomes and the way he will benefit the society in the future.
But I think this is an interesting point. I think if we look into the whole Bologna process, the one group that has really benefited from the Bologna process is the students. That's my claim. I don't have hard empirical evidence for that, but if you look into, and perhaps this is not that relevant for the Nordic countries, since students have been involved in all sort of academic affairs in the Nordic countries for decades. But in some European countries, particularly those in the East, where students didn't have a voice in these matters at all, we could see that the Bologna process have actually provided students with a lot more say, given the students a voice in the development. My hope is that students are really now also seeing the possibility of demanding their place at the table, so to speak. And we can see that in a number of institutions and in a number of if you look into national legislation, students are actually asked to be representative in important bodies and decision-making units inside the higher education institutions. And I think this is actually a much more important role for students than just being subject to student evaluation of teaching. Because I think it's a much more productive way for students to be part of these kind of discussions, where you sit around the table with the administration, with the study program leader, with the teachers, and you discuss issues. I think that's a far more productive way than to develop sophisticated systems of student feedback on teaching. Because student feedback of teaching, I think we do way too much of it. It's unproductive. I think we spend too much money on student evaluation of teaching. I might be provoking again now, but I think we are waste of money. Stop doing it. So you should spend much more time in involving students in these kind of productive meeting places. I think that's a much more efficient way of using the knowledge and engagement of students.
Hi. Okay. Can you hear me? No.
they will turn on the...
Okay. So my name is Guðrún Geirsdóttir. I come from the University of Iceland, and my main task is to implement learning outcomes.
Congratulations. You won the lottery.
No.
Yeah.
Well, just to more of a comment to the student representative here is, luckily, students' learning outcomes are not heavily a part of our quality assurance system yet, and I dread the day that they will be. But in our implementing policy, there are like two main threads that we use to, or the main reasons for implementing them. Is first of all, like you said, teachers often are not aware what the focus is of their modules. It's a tacit knowledge that they never talk about, they don't discuss, this is the way this is taught. So one reason is to engage academics in a dialogue, like you explained, to say what is the problem, what is the program about, what kind of students do we want to graduate, how can we actually go about this? But the main important thing is, learning outcomes are a tool, excellent tool, for a dialogue between the teachers and the students. Because by explaining why am I doing this, this is the purpose of the module, or this is what I would like you to attend to, that is often the only element that makes this dialogue go on in our experience. So I think as a conversation tool or a dialogue tool, they are very important between those two groups.
Yep. And of course, I mean, I don't think I need to comment that, but I think the potential, the really positive potential of learning outcomes is that it can do two things. It can, of course, it can specify some learning objectives, but it can also provide us with an incentive to rethink how do we evaluate students. You know, we spend a lot of time in universities and colleges examining students. At the University of Oslo, and we're not in the Nordic context now, we are a medium-sized university with 28,000 students. But in University of Oslo, we have 500,000 examinations each year. 500,000 examinations. You know, there's a lot of resources going into that kind of activity. We also know that formative feedback to student is a much more powerful tool for student learning than examination. But we still spend a lot of time and energy and resources on examination and perhaps too little on formative feedback. So the interesting thing is, you know, can we rethink our evaluation procedures? You know, there's been a lot of criticism that study programs after the Bologna process has been subject to fragmentation, because you have all these modules that have been created, and that has been a fantastic thing for many universities and colleges, because they can take these modules and they can develop and unpack new study programs, right? It's we take a little bit of West European knowledge and a little of leadership, and we take a little bit of economics, and voila, we have a study of entrepreneurship, right? Fantastic. So we have there are a lot of good things to say about that, but it's also a challenge to integrate study programs. And what sort of learning activities are you supposed to do then as a teacher? What sort of activities should you facilitate? If we're interested in critical thinking, independence, communication skills, okay, you can't just have lectures. Although I'm a defender of lectures, but you can't just have lectures. You need to have something else in addition. So you need to perhaps design and rethink your study program more in a comprehensive way. And I think that is the really nice potential with learning outcomes.
My name is Øystein Lund from the Norwegian Agency for Quality in Education, and I think I should be the little voice of quality assurance agencies into this. Thank you very much, Björn, for a very good presentation, and you will probably also know that we agree on a lot of things. Yeah. I think one of the important things here is that we shouldn't just treat the quality assurance agencies as someone very much outside, that wants to just please the government or something like that and have rules for everything. There has been a very interesting development, especially here in the Nordic countries for the last years, when it comes to trying to find new ways of getting into the what we could call the black box. What is really important in education, not only the framework and all that kind of stuff, but coming into really what's going on in teaching and how is quality made or not made. And it doesn't matter so much that we can measure it. It's more important that it is there. And most of you will be able to see it when it is there. But when we come into that area, it's and then we have been trying, and we also know ending up in just a few days to make a new legislation in Norway where we really focus on student learning process and the interaction between teachers and students. But then we enter into a new way of problem, because then we get in trying to finding the balance between saying to the institutions, these are the important factors, you have to focus on these. And we are not so much interested in seeing that you do this than that you do it. And then trying to find the balance between what can we really make as a kind of obligation that they have to do without stepping into the autonomy, both the institutional autonomy but also the academic autonomy of the teacher. So going into that area, which is important, where quality assurance needs to be, then we need to find this kind of balance. And I think there it is quite important in conferences like this, that we are able to talk with each other about what do the institutions really need. Because we see ourselves not only as a controlling body, but more as someone that institutional leaders and professors and especially students can lean towards when it comes to having kind of a help to get things moving in an institution. So our way of working as an agency is not so much only to be the controlling body, but to be some kind of partner. And then we are trying to find our new way of behaving, which then needs a very good conversation with you. I don't know if you want to comment, but we needed that voice from the agencies.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment?
Of course I want to comment. No, but I think I mean, if we take a European perspective, I think the Nordic countries are a bit special, because I think this finding this balance between control on the one hand and improvement on the other, I think that's part of the Nordic culture. And it's part of what we really like about our society, is that there is a relatively high level of trust between those who govern and those who are governed. And I think that's very important, that when we enter into these kind of new arrangement, that we try to keep that in mind. But of course, quality assurance agencies they have a very difficult job. I think this is one of the most difficult jobs that you could have in the higher education sector, because, as you say, you are somehow independent, but it's not really independence either, because you are also expected to deliver, right? You also have to, although and I think you are very honest in saying, in specifying your aims and objectives, that you really want to take this role as a negotiator in the sector in a constructive way. This is something that you have as an ambition. The problem is that the sector, they have their own opinion about what is NOKUT all about, and in many universities they tend to see everything that comes from the outside as some kind of an intrusion. Although I think we all deserve to be looked into our cards from time to time and to have critical questions asked. It's kind of amazing for me as an academic that when I do my research and I write my research articles, I send them off to international journals, and luckily most times they accept my articles, but sometimes I get them back with some strange comments about this article is not really relevant, and there are some questionable methodologies and rubbish, I would say. But for me, I take it. I take it and I try to develop the article. I try to take it on board. And so we have, as academics, we have this acceptance for that kind of external quality control that we take for granted, you know. Sometimes stupid, but okay, we take it for it's in the long run, it's productive. But when it comes to teaching, you know, don't come and tell me how I'm supposed to teach, you know. That's really, so we don't have this peer review philosophy in teaching. And I think if we are really looking into developing quality cultures in our higher education institutions, I think that is perhaps the crucial dimension. How can we develop a quality, a peer review culture in teaching? I think those institutions that are really good, they have this kind of culture, maybe as an implicit, tacit procedure, but I think that is really, really important. If we can do that, I think we don't need all these formative or formalistic concepts.
Well, this was a very good speech. It could almost be the ending words. I'm sorry to go back to learning outcomes. I just want to add something. I'm Helga Kekäläinen, the head of the higher education unit from the organizing body, FINEC. And how I see what is the possibilities of this implementation of learning outcomes is very much what you said already, that I think it forces people to think to what are the skills that are gained and how the needed skills in the labor market are gained in the higher education, that you have to somehow think where you could learn that, and then also how you assess that they have actually learned some of the skills. That I think one is, which I think it's healthy, it's good. Thinking of back when I went to university, we didn't do skills. So I think it's you, and now I'm looking at my daughter who is now in the she's just completing her bachelor. She has done a lot of presentations, a lot of papers. She has to all the time do things that I think will help her to find her place in working life. But then the other aspect that I want to also bring into the discussion is also the labor market side, because I think one of the motivation at LEAD was that when we have the learning outcome descriptions, that also students are more able to explain also in the working environment that what they can actually, what they are able to perform. I think that was a problem for a long time in higher education, that after 5 years, 6 years of studies, and then in the end they are not really, students not sure what they actually know and can do. I think that can also, I see there is some benefit in that part. Do you want to say anything about that connection to labor market?
Yeah, I think, but I think there is, I don't think, I mean, all empirical research suggests that higher education institutions are not really that adaptable to signals from the labor market. What we do know is that higher education institutions, they are very adaptable to signals from students. So the student voice is actually very important, an important driver for change and development. And we also know that the academic development within the field is also a very important driver for development. But labor market need is often not the thing that comes on the top of the list. I think we will see much more pressure on these kind of issues in the future, given the economic outlooks of Europe at the moment. But for me, I mean, and there's been a lot of research also on what is it that employers want from students. And we heard Anita Leikoinen say something about that this morning. And basically, I think it's good news. You know, they want problem solvers, they want critical thinkers, and you know, I don't have a problem with that. Do you have a problem with that? No, I don't think anyone have a problem with that. So these kind of values, they are echoing in many respects some of the inherent values that we have in our more Humboldtian-based systems of higher education. These are values that we share and that we really want our students to have. But perhaps that we haven't been good enough in providing them with that kind of skills and competencies in the past. But we have this tacit assumption that this is something that university education, for example, is providing students. So I'm not really worried about these demands from the labor market, because I think they fit well with what our inherent values, what we are trying to do in higher education.
And now the last comment before lunch, but don't be afraid, the dialogue will continue the whole afternoon. Please.
Thank you. Sigurður Sigurðsson, I work for the Icelandic Quality Board for Higher Education. We were talking about the emphasis on learning outcomes, and you mentioned formative feedback, the importance of that versus endless exams. But there's a huge resource implication in all of this. I mean, I've been a rank and file faculty member at a university where formative feedback was being pushed at the same time as classes got bigger and teaching assistants were being removed. So it's very easy to say learning outcomes should be the backbone and we should do more formative feedback and build these transversal skills, but it's a totally, the output measures of universities are not really supporting that.
I agree in the sense that if all feedback is supposed to be undertaken by teachers, that cannot be, we don't have resources for that. And most likely we will not have more resources in the future. I mean, take a look at the cuts now in Denmark and in Finland, and I don't think Norway and Sweden and Iceland will be shielded from this in the future. So I don't think the budgets will grow. So what is then, as you correctly point out, some of the challenges? I think there is a huge potential in student feedback to each other. I think, but that has to be taught. I think we have again research demonstrating that students, they learn a lot from each other. But students also have this idea that they can only learn from what the teachers have to say. So they provide they give the teachers a lot of legitimacy, and you're the big guru, and we want to hear it from you, and so forth. But so students really have to be taught that student feedback is actually very effective. So teachers then have to demonstrate, they have to provide arenas and ways to encourage student feedback. And of course, at some point, teachers has to be involved in that kind of, perhaps at a more meta level. But I think there is a lot of potential in students working together to provide each other feedback. And I think that is one way, and I think it's perhaps the only way that we can deal with the resource challenge in higher education. But we can't say to students, go and create a colloquium, you know. Go and create, it's very useful, go and create a colloquium. Because we know that the colloquium groups that students organize, sometimes they are functioning extremely well, and sometimes they are a pure disaster. And that is because they haven't really been taught how to work together in colloquium groups.
Okay, I think that now it's time to say thank you to Björn once more.
Just a very modest gift to remember Finland by. And thank you very much for a very interesting speech.
Thank you.
And then some practical information maybe.